following is a local resident producers program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Media Services, the City of Oshkosh, or Time Warner Cable.
Hi everybody, welcome to Eye on Oshkosh. Cheryl, Hentz, and Dan Rylance here. Beer brewing in Oshkosh has a very long and fascinating history in our city, one that dates back to 1846. At one time there were 12 different brewing companies here in the city, and while they've all but pretty much gone out of business a long time ago, the last one, People's Brewery, stopping in 1971 or 72, there's been a recent interest in home brewing. There's been legislation that's been passed in regards to that. And so there's just a lot of interest in brewing. And to help keep some of those brewing memories alive, we have two gentlemen here that we're very proud to welcome to the show. To my left, Lee Ryherzer and Ron Aiken, two local gentlemen who have written a book on the history of brewing in Oshkosh. It's actually called, and I should refer to my notes here so that I don't screw this up. It's probably easier if I just look at the book, The Breweries of Oshkosh, Their Rise and Fall. So thank you very much for being here, guys. We appreciate it so much.
Thanks for having us.
Well, we're going to get into the history that I sort of alluded to a little bit here, but first of all, let's talk just a little bit about the book. Where'd you come up with the idea, and why this particular topic?
Well, I can talk a little bit because I have been collecting brewery items from Oshkosh since 1973, as a matter of fact, so this is like the 39th year. And after all of those years, I've got a wild, crazy, numerous collection of items from Oshkosh breweries, such as Peoples and Chief Oshkosh from the Oshkosh Brewing Company, and from ours too. Most of the other breweries are so old that there was not much to find, and they didn't have much advertising anyway. So then it was in about December 2010 that I thought I ought to put all of this information together and start writing a book. So I did, New Year's Day 2011. I went down into my man cave in my house, and my wife will tell you that I didn't come up for sometimes 10 or 12 hours down there. I worked very hard for a long time. It was probably the middle of March or so that she and I went to a program down at the Oshkosh Library, a program that was put on by people whose ancestors were people that were coopers. Coopers are people that make oak barrels for breweries. And it was really interesting. In the middle of the presentation, they started talking about the National Breweriana Museum, which is located in a little town in Wisconsin, in Potosi. It's a fantastic place, and so when it was all over, they opened it up for questions and comments, and my dear wife stood up and said, "Well, I want you to know that my husband has part of his collection down at the Potosi National Breweriana Museum." And so after everybody left, Lee came up. He had been there, and he introduced himself and said that he writes this blog about the history of the breweries in Oshkosh and that I should check it out. And I went home and I did, and I was totally impressed. And we met several other times, and I found out that he had the passion, you'll find that tonight. He had experience in research, and he was a brewer of beer, and he had all kinds of wonderful qualities. And so a few months later, I asked him to be the co-writer of the book, and I've been blessed because of that. My wife calls him that he is my angel because he comes to my need whenever I'm in difficulty.
That's the only person that's ever accused me of that.
He's extremely talented, and our book is twice as large because of him. Unfortunately, he did caused me to meet a timeline, or miss a timeline that I wanted to meet by having it done by the end of May of last year. And we just finished. It's been a year and 7 months of work. And the printer has had the last month or so.
And this show is being taped on September 20th, right?
Yes.
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 Okay.
Now, you mentioned the blog, and we're going to be putting this up throughout the show, but it is oshkoshbeer.blogspot.com, and I think from there you can get to the other blog.
Right.
It's sort of a companion blog. It's oshkoshbeertimeline.blogspot.com. That one we won't be putting up because it's too long, but you can get there from going to oshkoshbeer.blogspot.com. Lots of really good, fascinating information. I would encourage you to check it out, just not during this show. So let's talk. The name of the book again is The Breweries of Oshkosh: Their Rise and Fall. Give us a little bit of history about the breweries in Oshkosh. Can you give us the timeline of what the breweries were like?
Sure. Essentially, brewing starts in earnest, commercial brewing in Oshkosh in 1849. That's when, late 1840s, these German immigrants began settling here. And they immediately set up breweries. These were all men that had been trained as brewers in Germany prior to coming here. And they just transported their life to Oshkosh, essentially, and picked up where they had left off in Germany. In the period, from 1849 until the Civil War, there were 5 breweries established in Oshkosh. All of them were north of the river. Most of them in the area around Bayshore Drive and Lake Street. After the Civil War, things start picking up. The breweries get larger. Breweries start coming in on the south side. And eventually these south side breweries become quite large. They overtake all the north side breweries. By 1875, 75% of the beer brewed in Oshkosh is brewed on the south side, on Doty Street. 2 breweries off of Doty Street. Things just continue to build in Oshkosh until about the early 1890s, and the panic of 1893 really hit the brewers of Oshkosh hard. It hit the whole city hard. People were laid off, wages cut, and the Oshkosh brewers were being pressured hard by the Milwaukee brewers. You had these huge brewers in Milwaukee that were bringing their beer up to Oshkosh. In the 1890s, Pabst, Schlitz, they had built large refrigeration houses in Oshkosh and tried distributing their beer here. Prior to that, Oshkosh really was dedicated to its own beer. So in 1893, this panic that occurred caused the consolidation of 3 of Oshkosh's largest breweries, and that consolidation resulted in the Oshkosh Brewing Company. And the Oshkosh Brewing Company was a phenomenal brewery, and by 1900, they had totally beat back the Milwaukee Brewers. They basically had a monopoly on beer in the city. The Rar Brewing Company was still here at that time. They owned a series of taverns or tide houses that they sold their beer into. But for most part, Oshkosh Brewing Company controlled the brewing industry in Oshkosh. That lasted until 1913, when People's Brewing started producing beer. And they were, People's Brewing was established by a number of saloon keepers, large group of saloon keepers, who were unhappy with the prices that the Oshkosh Brewing Company charged for their beer. So they had direct competition in town now. And in fact, they built their brewery almost across the street. Oshkosh Brewing Company was on Doty Street, just south of 16th. People's Brewing Company was on South Main, just north of 16th. So they went head to head, and it pretty much remained that way until Prohibition. After Prohibition, Oshkosh becomes somewhat unique in that there were 3 Oshkosh breweries prior to Prohibition: Rar Brewing Company, People's Brewing Company, and the Oshkosh Brewing Company. In America at large, after Prohibition, half the breweries were gone. Half the breweries that existed prior to Prohibition no longer existed. In Oshkosh, all 3 of the breweries that were here prior to Prohibition went back into business. And they all did fairly well for a number of years. Rar Brewing Company went out of business in 1956. They were the smallest of the bunch, and they just could no longer compete with the massive production of beer that was coming out of the Oshkosh Brewing Company and Peoples. And probably the peak years in Oshkosh were the late 1950s. By the late 1950s, you've got 100,000 barrels being brewed in Oshkosh. Per year. Okay. And if you look at it in context, like New Glarus Brewery, which is a brewery a lot of people are familiar with, They produced about 100,000 barrels this year. So there's a lot of beer made in this town. And it basically became, as the 60s wore on, the national brands were advertising heavily and really undercutting on prices and things like that, and it eventually drove them down. I mean, there was a number of reasons why these breweries went out of business, but competition became fierce, and people had less expectations for their beer also. These beers became very similar. So if you could buy a brand from, that was coming from Potosi, let's say, for 99 cents a six-pack, there isn't a whole lot of impetus to buy your hometown beer anymore. But Oshkosh, was unique in a number of ways that it really held on to that hometown beer for much longer than other cities that were brewing centers.
Now, you mentioned a couple of times the panic and I don't remember,
1893,
I think you said. What was that panic?
It was a bank panic.
And
it
panic,
basically, created a credit shortage, and, in Oshkosh was hit particularly hard, just like it happened with the housing crisis now. Oshkosh produced a lot of woodworking things that were based on new houses being sold, houses being built, and it just crippled Oshkosh.
Okay.
That's a national depression. It's not just Oshkosh.
Yeah, okay.
18th Amendment, Prohibition is from 1920 to 1933.
Right.
So that, you mentioned Prohibition, so that's a 18th Amendment passed by the people.
Yeah.
And then revoked in 1933.
And that was critical. That changed the beer culture nationwide. Less so in Oshkosh, but it eventually caught up with Oshkosh. When Prohibition occurred, here now all of a sudden you had a generation that was no longer part of this heritage that was passed on from family to family year after year. These were people that grew up drinking beer that was homemade, made at Wildcat breweries. There was numerous Wildcat breweries around Oshkosh. So they got used to beer that was somewhat stronger, maybe not as well made, and so their expectations were different. And you see 2 generations after Prohibition, this is where things really begin to change here. The expectations for the beer had been diminished, and people no longer had sort of a community investment in the brewery.
During Prohibition, did you see a lot of people, going underground, if you will, and starting to homebrew? Like we see a lot of nowadays?
Oshkosh was filled with brewers. Literally, there's a story that there was so much beer being brewed in the 6th Ward that the sewers would plug up because they were putting their spent grains down to the sewers. And Oshkosh, all through Prohibition, in 1929, the state did a survey of the results of Prohibition in Wisconsin, and they singled Oshkosh out. They said it's a wide open town. It's thoroughly wet. They said the police force is efficient with all matters except for the enforcement of Prohibition. And virtually every saloon stayed open here. They said they were selling soda. Most of them weren't.
One of the great quotes that we have on our book is that in Oshkosh they started drinking at dawn, and they drank until dawn.
Well, that's true. I mean, you can look at, when you think about it, I mean, bars are open until 2:30 in the morning, and then they open up again, I think, as early as 6 in the morning. Yeah. They're not closed very long. And, you talk to people from other states, and they say, a bar open at 6 in the morning, that's almost unheard of. But we have a lot of shift workers around here, so for them to be going to a bar at 6:30, 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, it's not that they're a bunch of drunks necessarily, it's that they're just coming off work. And
you have to understand it in terms of the culture that people from here are coming from. I mean, it was primarily German, and these people, beer was their companion. It was their daily drink. It wasn't necessarily something to get messed up on. It was just it was their food. And you even see that in a lot of the early ads. They talk about beers almost as if it's food.
It's a German tradition.
Sure.
Families,
How strong was the temperance movement in a city like Oshkosh during Prohibition?
Well, it's funny. The first temperance society in Oshkosh started in 1849, the same year the first brewery did, and they kind of ran parallel for a while. There were a couple temperance newspapers in Oshkosh, so there was a fairly substantial temperance movement. By the 1900s, it died out pretty much in Oshkosh. There were still surrounding areas, like the town of Oshkosh actually went dry prior to Prohibition. But you had the immigrants that had come here by 1910, they're pretty established, and they don't cotton to this idea that you cannot have beer. So the temperance movement, as Oshkosh became more of a second generation city, where these immigrants are firmly established here, they have good jobs, they have homes, they have families, the temperance movement began to die down then.
I assume Oshkosh didn't vote for prohibition.
No.
Otherwise.
In 1933 there was a vote. It was kind of a.
This was to get rid of it.
Yeah, it didn't mean a whole lot in Oshkosh, and it was the biggest turnout they had ever had in Oshkosh, and it was a resounding defeat that prohibition went down.
I mean, that's what we need to do to get more people to the polls. Not about drinking, huh?
You have a thesis in the book. This is more than just antiquarianism. This book has interpretation, and I want to ask you about the thesis you put at the beginning of the book. And you say that the book is how deeply the culture of beer and its brewing are intertwined with the inception and evolution of the city. Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful statement. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by that?
It goes hand in hand with the city itself. I mean, as the city grows, their brewers grow, and these brewers became prominent members of the city. That's kind of what's funny. You don't hear these men spoken about in the same way that you hear the people that ran the woodworking mills were. And for sure, they weren't as wealthy and they didn't contribute as much economically to the community. But within their within their groups, I mean, these were leaders of the city.
How many workers are employed by these? If you take your two big ones, how many people are they employing?
The peak, like around 1952, I think, would probably be about 100 people.
Okay.
After, I think, and most of those, about half of those were employed by the Oshkosh Brewing Company at that point. I think the peak that the Oshkosh Brewing Company had was 60 people.
Okay.
But it goes beyond that, too, because the beer is distributed to liquor stores and to taverns, and there are a lot of people that made their living in that way that were contributed by the breweries.
Yeah. Following on the economic interpretation a little bit, can you explain the tide system and how it was important to Oshkosh? What is the tide system?
That means that the brewery has management over a tavern. Sometimes they own them, sometimes they lease them, but they were in control, and so therefore they could determine what beer is going to be sold at that tavern. So there was the Rars Brewery that had like 25 different taverns in town. I suspect that the bigger breweries had more than that, particularly the Oshkosh Brewery. They had control, and they determined what beer was to be sold, and of course they wanted to sell their beer there. And that's why there was a revolution later on by many of the managers of these tide houses that's saying that they were limited as to what kind of beer they could sell, and it's not fair. But anyway, in Oshkosh, as in most cities that had breweries, many of the taverns were tied to the brewery or breweries that were there.
Okay. So if I go into one of these Tide breweries for like the Oshkosh company to have Chief Oshkosh, that's the only beer they serve then?
It
probably is the main beer that they serve.
Beer, yeah. But not another local one, probably.
Probably not.
Okay.
There were places that weren't tied as well. Not every tavern was tied. Many of them were. Okay. So you'll see pictures, and we have them in the book. During the Tide House era existed until Prohibition. Once Prohibition came in, it was done.
It became illegal.
Yeah. So you'll see some taverns, especially on Main Street, where they'll have signs for Kinzel's Gambrinus Brewery right next to Horn and Schwalm's Brooklyn Brewery. Okay. So, there were places where you could get different beers, but the money makers, like for the Oshkosh Brewing Company, Whiskey's Saloon, they built that. Okay. And that was just a prime outlet for them, and that's all you could buy there was Oshkosh beer.
Okay. In Ireland, Dublin is a Guinness city, and the rest of the country is Murphy country. And Guinness owns most of the pubs in Dublin, and Murphy Beer owns most of the rural ones, so that Tide system is still operating in another country.
There, successfully too.
Yes, yeah. Okay.
In the book, you sort of take your readers through each particular brewery and give, a history of each. Can we maybe touch on the various breweries and give a little history of each one?
Sure. Well, we could start at the very beginning. I mean, some of these are very short-lived.
Sure, yeah.
So 1849, the one that we believe is the very first commercial brewery in Oshkosh was started by Jacob Conrad. And that was a small brewery that came to be known as the Lake Brewery. That had a number of owners over the years: Jacob Conrad, Adolf Andrea, Gottlieb Eck. These are all very German names, obviously. Then also in 1849, on the lake over on Bayshore Drive by Frankfurt, Joseph Schussler started a brewery, another German immigrant. Schussler had a very interesting history. He came from Milwaukee, one of the earliest brewers in Milwaukee. And Schussler's interesting in another regard, that in 1850, one of his first ads, he puts in there, as good as Milwaukee beer. So they sense someone's over their shoulder, look at what they're doing. Just down the road from where Schussler was George Loescher. He had another brewery called the Oshkosh Brewery, another German immigrant. After Loescher, then Christian Kaler and Tobias Fischer had a brewery over in the 5th Ward, what it was the 5th Ward. It's on Algoma near Vine.
Okay.
There was a smaller brewery by this Fisher and a fellow named August Wiest, who ended up going to Ripon and starting Princeton, and starting the Princeton brewery. Then also on the north side of town, on Harney, Gottlieb Eck took the Lake Brewery and moved it a block west there over to Harney, and he built the Gambrinus Brewery. That was eventually taken over by a man named Lorenz Kinzel. Some of these names you might recognize. The Kinzel family is well known in Oshkosh, that for a while they owned Lee Beverage. Then on the south side, August Horn and Leonard Schwalm started the Horn and Schwalm Brooklyn Brewery. That was where the Oshkosh Brewing Company eventually built their brewery as well. That was on Doty, just south of 16th. On Doty, by 24th, John Glatz had a brewery. Glatz was another German immigrant, brewed in Cincinnati, Philadelphia for a long time in Milwaukee, was one of America's first really mega brewmasters. Brewed a lot of beer. Came to Oshkosh and started out all over again and built a small brewery, or took over a small brewery. The brewery he took over was actually built by Franz Wall, who started the Point Brewery, which still exists. That was his brewery. Now, like I said, the Kinzel Brewery, the Gambrinus Brewery, Horn and Schwalm, and Glatz, they merged in 1894, formed the Oshkosh Brewing Company. Then after that, in 1913, People's Brewing Company started up. Those breweries, I missed Rahr. On Rahr Avenue, the Rahr Brewing Company started in 1865 by Charles Rahr, a Civil War veteran, also a German immigrant. But Oshkosh Brewing Company went out of business in 1971. People's Brewing Company went out of business in 1972. And then from 1972 to 1995, there was nothing. 1995, Fox River Brewing Company in Fratello's comes online.
I want to ask about.
Them all.
You did really well.
Yeah.
I want to ask about the water. When I think of the lake now, and I wouldn't want to drink it. Water makes beer, doesn't it? I mean, that's really important.
Yes.
So the water quality here must have been really
It's
good.
not lake water.
Huh?
It's spring water.
Spring water. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the brewing process also mitigates some of the problems with
water.
Yeah, you're boiling the beer for an hour,
Okay.
At least. Some of these brewers were boiling for quite a bit more than that as well. I mean, some of these brewers had processes that you look at them now and they're just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
But we have good brewing water here, and it's kind of funny because the sort of water we have is particularly good for like ambers and darker beers. Okay. And early on, that's what they were all doing. They were all making ambers and darker beers. You didn't see these lighter-bodied beers coming in until 1880 or so. Then you start seeing Pilsners come on, and that trend continued.
What grains are you using? Are you using hops, and are those locally?
Especially the early brewers. They were using all what is known as 6-row barley, which is very different from the 2-row barley they had learned to brew with.
More heads
Germany.
on the stem? Is that what
exactly.
Okay.
6 kernels.
Okay.
So they did because this barley was so different, they had to come up with some ways to try to replicate the beer that they made in Germany. And they hit upon the use of corn, which helps bring down the protein content of this 6-row barley. And using, maybe 10 to 20% of corn in their beer, they could produce a beer that had very similar body and color and taste to what they were doing in Germany. Now the hops here were also different.
Okay.
And this area became a big hop growing region. By 1875, there was 175,000 pounds of hops grown in Winnebago County.
Wow.
In Oshkosh, there were at least 9 hop yards that I know of, just in the city itself.
Amazing.
So they were sourcing a lot of almost everything was local.
Interesting.
Yeah.
See, Dan was, I think, probably thinking that they were pretty much located by the water because they were using the water.
Right.
I was thinking more along the lines of that's where the railroad tracks came in and out of town.
Well, and
did they
It
use
goes
that?
beyond that. It has to do with the winter too, and the ice. They needed refrigeration, and Lake Winnebago froze over sometimes 3 feet deep, and that's where they'd get their ice to make sure that they had something to keep their beer cool during the
Okay,
summertime.
that makes sense.
These were lager brewers. So lager beer ferments at a cooler temperature. Ale ferments, you can ferment ale at 68 just fine. Lager beer, you want to try to get it in the 50s. Lower the better. So they would cut these huge blocks of ice off the lake and the river and drag them into their cellar, and that would help them extend the brewing season.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I want to talk about taste a little bit. I'm getting thirsty. No. You mentioned the earlier beers were a darker, and then they moved. But, obviously you haven't tasted them, but can you kind of, what did a beer taste like in the 1880s?
Well, one thing I can tell you is that there are some records about how much malt was going into these beers, and there was significally more malt going into them.
And what does that do?
It increases the body, increases the alcohol level.
Okay.
Now, not that these were like big bruising beers, I mean, they're probably still 5 to 6%.
Okay.
So they're very drinkable, and that's the other thing about that. It's hard to look at the way the beer culture of that period from our perspective, because now what people know about beer, they tend to either know about these very light beers,
The Pilsners.
or else the craft end of the spectrum,
Okay.
where you've got beers that are much more alcoholic, very pronounced flavors.
Okay.
A lot of times these aren't beers that you want to drink more than 2 of.
Well, if you've been to Germany, you know what the beer tastes like there, and I'm sure that the people that came here wanted to replicate what they were drinking back there, and it probably was fairly strong beer.
Are they drinking it warm?
And not warm.
Not warm, but not cold, real cold.
Yeah, and they didn't even have the ability to
Sure.
keep it cold like that. I mean, they would drink cellar temperature for sure.
Yeah.
And truly, these were all, beer's a long beverage. They would drink all day long.
What, we think of Oshkosh and we think of Sawdust City, the lumber industry and so forth. What percentage of our city's industry back then would you say was made up or comprised of beer production?
It'd be difficult to determine that. How many sawmills were there? I read one time there were like 70 down along the river.
Yeah.
And we didn't have that many breweries, that's for sure.
And the thing about these early breweries especially, they were pretty much neighborhood concerns. They weren't exporting their beer all over the place. To me, the Rar Brewery on Rar Avenue is a good example of that. When they took over that property, when they bought that property in 1865, there was nothing over there. It was sparsely populated. And within, a decade or so, you look at the censuses, and all of a sudden, the Rars were from Prussia. They were Prussians. The whole area is filled with Prussians. So they came over, and that area, that neighborhood built up around that brewery. And that's who they served. Their taverns tended to be in that area. Now, they did expand as years went on, but these were, these were really, it was a very localized product. They weren't early on. Now, that changed, but early on,
Well, they couldn't transport it very well. All they had were horses and wagons, There was hardly anything else.
Yeah, but by 1900 or so, Oshkosh Brewing Company had grown to the point where they were starting to say, we're a major force here. I think in right around 1900, they said they were contributing what would now be $2 million into the local economy, by what they bought from farmers, what they paid their workers. That's the other thing about the brewing industry. They tended to pay about twice what the people in the woodworking industry were making. These were good jobs, and these were craftsmen. This was highly skilled work.
Okay.
If they had a strike, it was really short. Nothing like what Payne went through,
Yeah.
Even shorter than the Chicago teachers' strike, maybe.
Before we get too far into our discussion here, you guys were kind enough to bring in a collection of some items and so forth, some cans, some bottles and whatnot. If we can just kind of get a shot of that, and maybe, I don't know,
It's up on the
Ron,
screen.
maybe you can take a look back here, or just look up at the screen and tell us what we're
Okay.
kind of
Yeah.
looking at here.
All right, well, I'll put this can back on that table. And I'll talk about the cans first.
Okay.
This was the first can that was produced for beer, and it's now called a crown tainer. The Oshkosh Brewing Company did use the crown tainer for about 1.5 years, and that's all. They didn't use the white one. There may be 1 or 2 or 3 white ones in the country someplace because they were mailed test cans. They used a can similar to this, only it was silver in color, and that too is a very rare can and worth a lot of money. This is called the cone top right here. And if I may digress for a little bit, I want to talk about this can because I first became interested in Breweriana when I was out hunting one day up in Forest County with my son who walked behind me. This was back in the 1970s, 1973, and my brother was walking beside him. So I'm walking ahead of him with my gun, and my son said, who was in 6th grade, I believe, at South Park Middle School, he said, "Dad, look at all the cone tops." I said, "What in heaven's name is a cone top?" He said, "The cone top beer can right down to your right. Look down the depression on the side of this trail." And this is a cone top beer can, which I didn't know until 1973. And this is one that the Oshkosh Brewery also canned their beer in, and they used the crown tainer and the cone top because it would fit right into their bottling system, you see.
The cone top is obviously this part on top here, what we're talking about, right?
Obviously,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, but I mean, we want to maybe show that, yeah.
Okay.
Because
yes,
that would
right
be
here.
different than a can today that wouldn't have the cone top.
Definitely.
Okay.
And this is the can that came into existence, I think it was 53, right? 1953.
Yeah.
And this is now called a flat top can. You don't see any pull tab up here.
Okay.
It was opened with an opener that had a point on it, all right?
Yep.
And so this was the second one that they used. And as we
The first
continue,
beers I drank, I had to have that.
we have
Key.
Church key.
this one right here, which was a gold one. It came in different variations. And this was one of the last ones that they used. And this too came in a variety of variations. In other words, the wording was very different up on the top. This happens to be the pride of Winnebago land. And then, as the year progressed and the Oshkosh Brewing Company had some financial problems, they began to buy the names of other breweries. And this is Rars, but it's not the Oshkosh Rars. This Rars came from Green Bay. There was a relative of the Oshkosh Rars that ran a brewery up there. And what the Oshkosh Brewery did is to buy this name and buy the recipe, and they tried to make money by making Rars beer instead of just Chief Oshkosh beer. So that's kind of an evolution of the cans, all right?
Okay.
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 right. Yeah, go
Continue just a minute. Lee, you talk about the profits of keg beer versus bottled beer and canned beer. And since Ron has the bottles back there, and we just talked about cans, can you kind of go through the stages of profit of kegs versus bottles versus cans?
Yeah, well, early on, all the beer was keg beer. Bottles don't really come in, in mass until the late 1870s. And in Oshkosh, the drinkers seem to prefer keg beer to bottle and cans. Now, as the Oshkosh Brewing Company evolved, they decided they were going to move away from keg beer and transition into bottled beer.
Okay.
And they did it very successfully. But at the same time, then they lost a good deal of the saloon trade, or the tavern trade in Oshkosh to the Peoples, who remained primarily a keg-based beer. And there's a distinct difference between the two styles of beer at this point. The keg beer is unpasteurized. All the bottled beer is pasteurized. Okay. Typically, a lot of times that beer was not filtered either. The bottled beer was all filtered. Okay. So, I mean, there would be significant flavor differences. Now that changed as kegging became more sophisticated and bottling became more sophisticated. But Oshkosh was a little bit slow to change over to the can. They didn't like cans when Oshkosh Brewing Company first started doing cans in 1949. They got a lot of backlash. People just didn't buy it, and they didn't sell well. It wasn't until like the mid '50s where I mean, even though they were bottling a lot, it wasn't until the mid '50s that cans really started becoming prominent.
And you got to have, if you go to bottles and cans, you got to put more equipment in your.
Yeah,
that costs more too.
Well,
right?
like Ron had shown with that cone top, the reason they did that initially is they could run that through a bottling line.
Oh,
the flat tops needed a dedicated can line. Okay. They couldn't. Yeah, they had, and it was an expensive piece of equipment.
Okay. Is a brewery making more money on a keg, bottled beer, or canned beer?
At different times, it's different ways. Later on, it became bottled beer.
Bottled beer.
Early on, it was more expensive to produce the bottles, and it was a slow process. But they also charged a premium for it. Okay. One of the reasons the Oshkosh Brewing Company went so heavily towards bottled beer is they could charge quite a bit more for it. I mean, substantially more than that they could out of keg. But this is at the time when refrigerators are starting to become common in the home too, and they really exploited that.
One more question on
Sure,
money.
go ahead.
Who made the most money of the brewers in Oshkosh? Were there any millionaires made out of those who owned the breweries?
I can't give you like definite figures, but without a doubt, the owners of the Oshkosh Brewing Company.
Okay.
Well, I think that one thing we could point out that many of the brewery owners had very big homes.
Okay.
Let's talk about the Glotz home. It's to the west of Artie and Ed's. It's right on the corner of 24th and Doty Street, okay? And there's a mansion there. That was owned by the Glotzes. That's one. Let's go down Doty Street to the north, and you come close to the Oshkosh Brewing Company. There's a great big house on the east side of the street with big white pillars and a beautiful cream bricks, and that was owned by August Horn, who was a part owner of the Oshkosh Brewing Company. The Schwalms lived out on the lake. So I don't know whether they were millionaires back then, maybe not, but they did quite well.
Yeah. Okay.
Certainly some of the richer people in town, I think.
Oh,
we
yeah.
could
They
safely say.
were.
Yeah. I'm done with economics for a while.
All right.
Thank you, though, for your answers. That's good.
One of the things that I found interesting as I was going through the book, and it's a beautiful book. I didn't get to finish reading the whole thing, but it's a beautifully written and illustrated book. Absolutely. I'm not sure where you got all those illustrations, and I want to talk about that in a little bit as well. But one of the things that, as I was going through it, I found very interesting, and it's a piece of trivia about People's Brewing Company, that in 1970 they became the first brewery, not just in Oshkosh or in the state, but in the nation, to be owned by an African American, Theodore Mack Sr. But that ownership, of course, brought a lot of controversy, and about a year later the business went out of business. But the controversy wasn't about race or bigotry necessarily. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's one part. People, if they know stuff about brewing in Oshkosh, they tend to know, this is one of the stories they tend to know, that in 1970, Theodore Mack, a black man from Milwaukee, bought the People's Brewing Company. And then there was a backlash that was racially based, especially on the south side of town, where People's had always been very strong. Some taverns refused to sell the beer. Some people refused to buy it. The part of the story that's not told is that within a year of that, Theodore Mack had totally won the city over. He was a local celebrity, probably the best known person from Oshkosh at that point. Now, he made some business mistakes where he wanted to take this brewery national. It was an urban strategy. He wanted to sell it in Milwaukee, Gary, Indiana, Memphis. So he overextended himself financially. And we have a couple quotes in the book. You know, he was a sociology major in college, and he said, "I thought I knew something about human nature until I got into the brewing industry. I found out I don't know a damn thing about human nature." And one of the things he found out is the areas where he thought he would have a hard time selling beer, like in Oshkosh, other parts of Wisconsin, he was totally embraced, did very well. The places where he thought he'd sell, Milwaukee, Gary, Memphis, they rejected the beer. And that's essentially what drove that brewery out. There was no money left.
Well, but I'm going to continue, Lee, and say that there were a lot of small breweries in Wisconsin that folded about that time. The Rars Brewery right here in Oshkosh folded in '56. The Oshkosh Brewing Company folded in '71, pardon me, People 72. But many of these towns around here, Manitowoc and Menasha and Ripon and Hortonville and Fond du Lac and Sheboygan, they all had little breweries, and they're all gone, and they all seem to dissolve about the same era, okay? So it wasn't Ted Mack's problem. It was a problem of small breweries trying to compete with the bigger ones. That's the way I look at it. A few survived, Leinenkugel and Point and the one down in Monroe, Huber, I think it used to be called.
Yeah.
But that's three. That's about all there that survived that era.
Another thing that I found interesting is that they actually, some of the claims that they put in their ads to promote beer, and I think
Brewers will say anything.
well, let's see. And these were during Prohibition that these ads came out. Ads saying that People's Beer was real food because of the grains and the nutritious salts that it contained. Or another one saying people who drank plenty of Oshkosh beer were always strong and healthy. I was so intrigued with those kinds of ads.
That was just before Prohibition that many of those ads came out, and I thought that they were fighting the possibility of Prohibition by trying to tell people that beer is a health food. And in one instance, the People's Brewery actually encouraged pregnant women to use their beer because of the medical benefits that it had. And they ran a lot of ads like that, and that's the way I interpret them, to save us, you know?
The brewers made a big mistake. Instead of aligning with their natural, the people on their side, they jumped to the other side. They lined up with the temperance people, saying beer's a temperance drink. You can drink beer and not get drunk. You can't drink whiskey and not him. So it was a poor strategy to begin with. One thing that's interesting, I think, about that Oshkosh Brewing Company ad, where they say, they talk about it being this tonic, and their recommended dosage was a gallon a day. So
wow.
Yeah.
Okay. We're about 3/4 of the way through with the show, I think, and I want to finish up our display over here. If you guys want to kind of tell us again, just sort of turn around and point to what we're looking at here.
The bottles.
This is kind of an evolution of bottles, okay? And this would be the first one right here, and whether they ever used them in Oshkosh, it's a ceramic bottle made out of clay and baked, and a lot of breweries used bottles just like that. And it just so happened, I was telling Lee just before the show started, that I found that one right here in Oshkosh, and they were doing some digging on the corner of Pearl Street and Jackson Street and putting in some sewer pipe or something like that, and there was a pile of dirt beside the road, and it had about 5 or 6 of these bottles. And I thought, hey, maybe one of the Oshkosh breweries used these bottles. And I asked if I could have one, and they said yes. And I looked all over for words like rar or something like schussler, but there are no words at all. I don't know. All I know is I found it, and it may have been used by a brewery here in town. But these are the first types.
Yeah.
All right. And then they used glass, and they embossed the glass. And this one says property of the Oshkosh Brewing Company.
Okay.
And it was probably available in the late 1890s, I would guess, and it was used into the 1900s. And then what they did is that they put labels on the other side. So this label right here has to be one of the first labels that the Oshkosh Brewing Company ever used. And I think that it dates back to about 1902.
Okay.
So to have a paper item, a paper piece of advertising, that's pretty special because paper gets destroyed so easily. And I'm a guy that likes to collect this pre-prohibition stuff because just notice the artistry that it has. And I'll consider the labels that are put on bottles these days. It's unbelievable, the difference. All right, so from embossed to labeled, and then we're going to talk about an era during World War II. World War II produced a problem, excuse me,
It's okay,
World
you're
War
doing
II produced a problem with metal. They needed all the metal they could possibly get, and they told the brewers that you're going to have to stop using as many
Turn it
of these.
Right there.
There.
There you
Okay,
go.
There we
Okay.
go, right there.
Yep.
I'm sorry. As many of these bottle caps as possible. So notice the cap on this one right here, produced during the war. And right here is a similar one. It's a quart-sized bottle, and it too was made large. They had to make bigger ones so they didn't use as much metal in their caps. So that's kind of interesting. But after the war, why they went back to the regular bottles, okay? Like this one right here.
Okay.
So that's kind of a short explanation of the evolution of some of the beer bottles that are used.
This one's full.
It's for after the show.
That's it. We'll just say it's full, but don't touch it.
Because we heard you say you're thirsty.
Yeah, I'm getting more thirsty. This is like a party.
Well, what I want to do also, Dan, since the book is right in front of you, if you kind of want to just, whoever, if you or one of you gentlemen want to flip through the book and just kind of show us some of the really, really beautiful
You want to
illustrations
play on
that
that
are in
camera
there.
over there, huh? Here, I'll get these.
One thing
Could I talk about the cover?
Sure.
Yes,
All right,
please.
Hold it
this
right
is
up so
probably
can't-
one of the nicest pieces that I have. This is the picture that you're looking at is of a lithograph dated 1901, and it is has a tin background to it, and the lithograph was laid over the tin, and I like it particularly because of the detail. Not that I'm an expert artist, but I do some stained glass, and I like to make my own figures. And I look at this, and I can't believe the detail of it.
It's incredible.
I can't
It
believe
really
the
is.
color of it. And I'm going to have it. Well, excuse me. If anybody wants to see it, I will show it to them. But these train cars back here have Chief Oshkosh Beer written on them. That's how detailed it is. The Oshkosh Brewing Company on this particular lithograph looks like it's really a big building.
It does.
And in fact, this is only a two-story building, and it still exists down on Doty Street in the 1600 block. So what the artist did was to draw these wagons and horses and people down there, very, very small. This, by the way, is a composite artist rendition of the Oshkosh Brewing Company. Remember how Lee said that there were 3 breweries that merged to form the Oshkosh Brewing Company? Well, this is the Horn and Schwam Brewery right here, and this is the Glotz Brewery over here, and this is the Gambrinus Brewery back there. All right, so he put them all together right in that little space, and it turned out really well, as you will agree. So I'll explain that, and I'll.
Do you know
turn
who
it
the
over to
artist
you.
was?
Pardon?
Do you know who the artist was?
I do not know.
Okay, that's
no.
incredible.
But the artistry back then, it just seems as I look at all of those pieces that were done pre-Prohibition, absolutely fantastic. They spent a lot of time on what they did.
This is the picture I'd like to point out.
Okay, sure.
So this is
Put it to this camera here.
this is
You're getting
the
a glare on it.
We have to just, I think, tilt it a little
Yeah,
bit so
that's
that we
better.
don't-
so this is
There we go.
Lorenz Kinzel's Gambrinus Brewery, which is on the 1200 block of Harney, on the south side of Harney.
Yes.
My directions in the city
okay.
just don't seem bad up there. But the house you see there, that was Lorenz Kinzel's house. He was the brewmaster.
Okay.
That house still stands.
Right there.
And the brewery that you see off to the side, that was built by Gottlieb Beck in 1869. And it stood until 1913, I believe, is when it was torn down. After those 3 breweries merged to create the Oshkosh Brewing Company, they converted that brewery into a bottling house. So that bottle that Ron showed you before there with the paper label, that probably came right out of that, that area. But these pictures were provided us by Lee Beverage Company, which at one point was owned by the Kinzel family, and they had some of these pictures there. And the pictures that we got are, I mean, from a variety of sources.
And they're multicolored. Maybe just show up the one
Sure.
that you do. I mean, it's more than black. I mean, these are colors in there. Just amazing.
Just tilt it up.
I mean, we had just so many people contribute and help out
Yeah.
with the images and things like that. It was amazing. And it was always a constant surprise to us what people were coming forward with.
Yeah.
And we also have a large number of pictures in here that are from collections of brewery memorabilia. And yeah, much of it's in color.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Well, and it helps to break up reading.
Oh, absolutely.
Not
We're a
that the-
visual society now.
Right,
We're
not that the
reading,
book
yeah.
is monotonous in any shape,
No.
form, or fashion, but it's nice to look at something as you're reading.
That
to,
was
to
one
make
of
the referral.
yeah, and that's something we from the beginning we wanted to do. We wanted to have as many pictures as we could possibly fit in there, and I think we did all right. It was sometimes it was tough getting everything in we wanted to get in, but I think it worked in the end.
History can be really boring unless you've got pictures,
Yes.
unless you've got visual aids to help you through
This
it.
is a creme de creme of a local book. You're not going to get bored reading and looking at this
And
book.
I've tried
you know?
to write stories of the people, interesting stories, stories that are humorous, stories that are, I've even got a ghost story in there, and there are stories that are sad too, of death and destruction. So we've gone from one end to the other,
And that's
try and find out interesting stories.
The story part is important because that's one thing we wanted to do is,
Yeah.
you know, all the names and dates are there, but we wanted to give them within a context that's very readable and interesting. And I think for the most part we achieved that. I don't think
Oh, I think so too.
it's not dry.
It's got some personality, that's the way I put it. And you will
Beer has
enjoy reading it.
personality. You've
Right.
captured the brewers that made the beer.
Yeah, these were interesting people. I mean,
Yeah,
some
incredible.
of them had some quirks and you know, but they're fun to write about.
It was fun.
Well, let's talk. Did you have any other questions
I
about the book itself?
I have a future question just at the end. but
Okay,
go
all right.
ahead.
Because we're down to probably about 7.5, 8 minutes. So in our remaining time, and before Dan gets to his future forward-looking question, let's talk about you know, how you guys work together. How do you decide who's going to write what? Let's start there.
I call us the odd couple because of the age difference. But believe it or not, we worked through our little issues, and there were some issues, but they were few and far between, and it only took us like a few minutes to resolve them. You know, we each would give it a little, and I'm happy with what the product is right now. I'll explain that I did write most of my book before I met Lee, but when I met him, I thought, well, and read his blog, I thought, there's an awful lot that could be added to what I have. And that's what he did. And he gave me the opportunity to look at what he was doing, and he when it was done, but he said that he would have my writing here and his here, and he'd try to put them together. And I thought, well, that's good to have one writer do it instead of two. That would make it more smooth as people read through it. And that's the way it was done, too. So he would say to me then, when he was done with something, now read this over, and if you've got any comments, let me know. He was nice enough to do that, and that's the way we worked through it, and it worked pretty well. That's my contribution.
Yeah, we were in contact all the time, every day. You know, I don't know how many emails we'd fly back and forth a day, you know, but it was very smooth. I mean, for as different as we are, it's amazing how well we get along together.
Yeah. And so you mentioned few and far between, but there were a few creative differences. How do you go about solving creative differences?
Whoever gets tired of yelling then loses. No, I mean, really,
I'll tell you how we do it. Well, I had an issue about writing bad things about the brewery workers or brewery owners, and he dug up some stuff that was sometimes there were some stories that were a little bit negative, and I said to him, Lee, there are relatives that are living in this area, and they aren't going to want to know that. And he said, but that's what happened, and we need to report it. I said, well, let's just try to simmer it down as far as we can. And he said, okay, I will do that. All right?
Yeah,
And that's how we resolved our
So
issues.
it's compromise.
yeah, I
You
mean,
bet.
nothing gets whitewashed. Everything that we found is pretty much in there. But I mean, there's ways of doing it without, you know,
Of course.
potentially offending somebody, I
Yeah.
guess.
Well, if politicians could just kind of keep that in mind.
Yeah.
So, you know, basically then you wrote the majority of it, Ron?
I wouldn't say that, no.
Okay.
He did a lot of research beyond what I did,
Okay.
and the book, as I would put it, is twice as big as the one I would have written, and maybe more, okay, because of Lee's contribution.
And how
Okay.
it worked is he had given me what he had written and I had what I had written. So then I took that and synthesized everything into one text.
Okay. All right. And how long altogether then were you two working together, and how long did it take you to assemble all this artwork?
It's
and put it all
difficult to know
together?
exactly when Lee and I met each other, but I began, as I said, in January of 2011, and we finished our work, I think it was in August of this year.
Yeah, it was about
So,
14 months, I think,
okay.
altogether. I mean,
Well,
but
more than that.
yeah. But like the research had gone, you know, I had done quite a bit of research and he had done quite a bit of research, so that had taken place independently. The actual thing when we were coming together. I'd say, I don't know, 14, 15 months later on.
Well, if I started in January and it finished in August the next year, that's a lot more than that, Lee. Yeah.
All right. Well, just lost my train of thought on this question. Where can people get the book? Let's go with
I
that
can
one.
explain that. First off, I'm going to be selling it on eBay, and that's going to be starting this coming Monday, which would be the 24th of September.
And by the time this show airs, that will have passed.
I know that,
So.
but then it will be on
just letting
eBay
the
right
viewers
now, and Lee is going to have it listed on his blog spot. You can check out there, and it's going to be at a fixed price. It's not going to be at an auction. It's $29.95. I'll announce that right now.
$39.95.
Excuse me, $39.99. You're right. And it also is going to be on sale at the Apple Blossom Bookstore. It's going to be on sale at the Camera Casino. It's going to be for sale at Fratello's. It's going to be for sale at our 2 antique shops at the Star Gallery on Oregon Street and at Originals out on Washburn Street.
Okay.
So those are the places it's going to be sold.
All right.
$39.95.
Now, by the time this airs, you will have had a book signing at Fratello's. Do you have any other book signings lined up?
Not yet.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
I'm sure they'll probably
You
be
foresee
working.
some,
Yeah.
though. All right. Now, is this book self-published? That was the question I was going to ask before.
Yeah, I mean, we started out with a publisher, and we eventually kind of got to the point where it was better for us to go our own way with it. So that's.
Well, Lee, it wasn't. He kind of said I didn't. He said I really wasn't that interested to begin with, and now I see I'm making some mistakes, so I just as soon turn it over to you people. But he did suggest to us a printer that we used, and that worked out really well.
Is it a local printer, statewide printer?
It's Stoughton, in Stoughton Books.
Okay.
Books
Yeah.
on Demand in Stoughton, Wisconsin.
Okay.
They
did
were
a
very
re-
cooperative
nice
and did a
job.
very nice job.
And when you deal with a books on demand kind of thing, it's as you have the need for more books, you can publish more books, correct?
Yeah, well, that name doesn't really imply what they are. They're a regular printer. But yeah, it's like this print run is 1,000, so we'll see if demand requires another one, then we'll cross that bridge, I guess, when we get to it.
Okay.
The book opines in a hope for a second chapter in the history of brewing in Oshkosh.
Yes.
Now, it began with Fratello's. Do you see more of this going on in the future?
I think it's inevitable. I mean, if you see the interest, especially amongst young people, for the way people are becoming interested in beer, it's not just light beer anymore. People are, and just the amount of home brewing in this city. This city has a club. The Society of Oshkosh Brewers has 70 home brewers in it. There's a lot of home brewing activity. So with that kind of thing, what tends to happen is breweries begin to develop around those people, and I think you'll see more of that.
Okay, very good. Well, listen, thanks to both of you very much for being here. We appreciate
Oh,
it.
thank you.
And congratulations on the book.
Thanks.
It's just a beautifully done book all
This
the
is
way
a great
around.
book. It really
So,
is. You should be proud
Thanks.
of it.
Yes.
I've heard some good words. I've heard awesome. I've heard just today very professional
Okay.
and great, and your comments too, and they're very much
All
appreciated.
right. Thank you very much, and good luck with the book. And that's going to do it for us. We will see you next time. Until then, take good care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.